Hello. It is great to see you all. Welcome to the One Take documentary series at the Little Theater, which I'm happy to say is owned by WXXI, our public media station here in Rochester. And this doc series that we've been doing has been running every month since 2012. So it's really a great honor to have you both. Yes, Amy, I'm a fan of your work, but Tia and Carl, I am very familiar with your work as well. So it's really an honor to be having this discussion with you all. I know we were going to have Amy in person, but I'm really glad that we get to have Tia and Carl on this discussion too. So it worked out really well. Um,
Frankly, Linda, I think this is a much better trade. Having the two of them on with me, I would trade me alone any day.
I
At
think
this rate, you two just continue along the same lines as you're doing. No, thank you so much, Linda. We're really honored to be part of the series too, and it's fun to be on with everybody.
great. So I think origin stories are kind of important. So I would love to hear about the origin story for this film. I suspect Amy has been approached many times to make a film about her life and Democracy Now! And obviously you all have a bit of a relationship and, Tia and Carl's work speaks eloquently for what they do. So I'm really curious about how this all began.
Well, I'll start with that. Well, we love Amy. Carl and I have been longtime listeners to Democracy Now! We have been occasional guests on the show with our films Trouble the Water in 2008, Citizen Coke 2013, my film The Janes in 2022. So we've been on the other side of the desk and we've watched her work. But I think it might have started about 25 years ago when I volunteered for Amy and Democracy Now! In Philadelphia at the Republican National Convention. Um, she was trying to take the the radio show to television, and I volunteered to help with that. I had been producing for Michael Moore's TV show for a few years, and so I had some familiarity with running and gunning with a video camera, and so I followed Amy around the corridors of the Republican National Convention as she cornered politicians and billionaires and billionaire politicians, and she asked some pretty extraordinary questions. Extraordinary not because she shouldn't have been asking, but everybody should have been asking these questions. Some of the footage that I filmed that day of Newt Gingrich and her asking President H.W. Bush about his assault on Iraq, the first Bush, appears in the film. So I got to see up close and personal how, extraordinary Amy was, that she was really undaunted and by power, and that she also had an incredible team with her. So it was just lovely when Karen Renucci, the producer of this film, came to Carl and me and presented this possibility, and it was a no-brainer. We said yes.
And I want to add that, of course, um, having known of Amy's work and crossed paths a little bit before Tia did the convention with her. I mean, at that time in her career, Tia was pretty badass already. She was the lead producer for Michael Moore. She was, a master at what she was doing. But I remember when she came back from that convention, and it's almost like her pupils were dilated. She was so excited and so invigorated by doing this work with another woman, with Amy, and inspired in a way that we've actually been seeing audiences. I understand it a little bit when they see the film and when they see what Amy does. Tia came back and said, I need to expand my toolkit and do more stuff like Amy does. So, so
Well,
she's been influential as well for us personally.
and actually, I'm not sure I've told you this, Amy, but we literally expanded the toolkit because I brought home one of your radio mics and I have it to this day. So
I okay, Tia, hand it over.
It's right on the other side of this wall here. We bronzed it, and we're going to sell it on eBay to finance the distribution of the film. What do you think?
there's, funding comes in many ways, perhaps, right? Okay, so many questions. I think that's an amazing origin story. I'm also curious about making a film about someone that constantly interviews others. They know how you're doing, what you're doing. So having a different level of communication, I'd love to talk about that. And then also Amy being on the other side of the microphone and the camera. What is that like for you?
Hell. And I didn't say hello. Uh, it really, I felt it was so important to get a film out about independent media that my own discomfort, well, just I had to put it aside. And uh, also, Carl and Tia, who they are, Oscar nominated filmmakers for Trouble the Water. Their film about Hurricane Katrina was magnificent. Tia most recently did The Janes about abortion and Chicago and people who persevered through so much. Citizen Coke was such an important, daring film that I knew if anyone was going to do this, they would be the people who could really understand the critical importance of how independent media is essential to the functioning of a democratic society. And the idea that, the idea of a media, when we cover war, not brought to you by weapons manufacturers, when we cover the climate catastrophe, not brought to you by the oil, gas, and coal companies, when we cover inequality, not brought to you by the financial institutions, but brought to you as listeners and viewers, funded by the very people who just believe in independent media, that's such an important model. And who knew it would be more important today than it was 30 years ago? But as we can see with the current administration eviscerating the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, I mean, here we are. We no longer talk about CPB. We only talk about CBP, Customs and Border Protection, right? And the immigration agencies. And yet, what does it mean to be a civilized society? Where you elevate the arts, where you provide a forum for people to debate and discuss the most important issues of the day, war and peace and life and death. And that is something that we not only have to shore up, but we have to expand around the world. And, Democracy Now! Knows no borders, as reporters should know no borders. We started 30 years ago online at democracynow.org and on public television and radio, community television and radio. And we started on the internet out of necessity. How do we get our radio show? We started before the word podcast. So how do you get that hour out to the different stations? Other entities could pay satellites. We didn't have that money, and the intertubes were free. And so since we posted it at democracynow.org, then people started to transcribe it. We'd have our first segment transcribed in Mexico, in Montana, in Michigan. Our third segment, they would send it to our transcribing coordinator. We'd have the whole show transcribed within a few hours. And then reporters from all different networks would take those interviews to the White House, to the State Department, to the Pentagon, because the people we interview, they're the people closest to the story, not the pundits who know so little about so much, explaining the world to us and getting it so wrong, but the people who are deeply affected. And I think that's the authenticity of Democracy Now!, why we call it news with a heart.
And I would just build on that. I think Amy understands from a journalistic storytelling point of view that that it's people relate to other people's stories. And from a filmmaking point of view, we felt the same thing. And so we really wanted to paint a portrait of Amy because she is such a relatable person and she has so much love and compassion and this deep commitment to telling stories. and to asking the hard questions. And it felt to me like a natural way to get people to care about the press is through the story, of this extraordinary woman. In terms of, trust, look, it is to Amy's credit that she allowed us to put our cameras on her. That is, no one wants to be mostly no one wants to be in the frame. I can think of a few notable exceptions today. But she, I think, understood that our ethics as filmmakers are really the same as hers as a journalist. Report things accurately, be true to people's stories, and do no harm. And maybe more than do no harm, actually do some good in the world. And that's certainly what we've tried to do with this film.
Yeah, I think obviously Democracy Now! Sees the humanity of people behind all the stories and numbers, and it's about treating people as sentient beings and seeing them for who they are. And I feel like you've done the same with your film, like seeing Amy and Democracy Now! And really broken it down that way. It's quite beautiful. And timely. I mean, obviously, it's always been a timely issue of this story, but I feel like it is so prescient right now, and how important it is, and rolling it out at this moment in time.
Who knew? Amy said 10 years ago, who knew how relevant it would be 2 years ago, who knew how relevant it would be too. And it is a good time. It is a good time. And I'm gonna try and do something that Amy does every single day. And that is to contextualize this film against this really dark moment, and cast some light on it in a good way. Because what we see when we screen this film for audiences, and we hope that your audience is enjoyed the film and responds in the same way, is people don't feel necessarily depressed or despondent about it. They feel invigorated and they feel excited and they feel hopeful, like there's something to do. And that they've seen an example of I mean, when you see people experience people doing the right thing for the right reasons, even when it's really, really hard, it's just inspiring. And so we hope that's a contribution that this film can make, and that we can capitalize on that incredible sentiment now. It's almost like we don't have to convince people. People are already there with us. We just need to give them the ammunition. I wish there was a better.
Well,
We
I
need
think
we
it's
need to
an
give them the
example.
tool.
I mean, what Amy presents is this example, a personal example, but also a institutional example of independent journalism. It's in this time where journalism is so under attack and so much of journalism is compromised by the corporate ownership and the billionaire ownership. Um, Her example and the example of Democracy Now! Is kind of a reminder of what journalism can still be. It doesn't have to be about algorithms. It doesn't have to be about mergers. It doesn't have to be about infotainment. It is about asking questions, asking the hard questions, and listening to people's voices that are on the ground, that are, as Amy says, that are at the target end of our weapons.
And, Linda, I've always referred to the corporate media, and reporters would say, do you have to talk about us in that way? Now they're saying they're the first ones. I mean, for example, the Washington Post, owned by the billionaire Amazon founder, Jeff Bezos, just laid off a third of the staff after paying off the Trump family $40 million for a documentary about Melania Trump, the first lady, and another $35 million on top of that for publicity. But lays off a third of the staff, almost the entire Middle East department. The reporter on the front lines in Ukraine, she got an email that she was no longer working for them as she is reporting. We just had on the Washington Post reporter, who is no longer the Washington Post reporter, who is one of those who broke the story about the US bombing the girls' school in Manab in the south of Iran that killed over 170 people, about a dozen teachers, and overwhelmingly little girls. And it is so important now that those reporters are the ones who are saying you've got to stress what corporate ownership means. Because, you know, newsrooms aren't the ones, the parts of these multinational corporations that make these companies money. So they're dispensable. They're not, however, dispensable to a democratic society. And so you have Skydance merging with Paramount. Paramount is run by the Ellisons. Larry and David Ellison, very close allies of President Trump. They own CBS, are now about to take over CNN and HBO. These are very serious times. And just seeing what Carl and T are doing, I've learned so much about the distribution of film. I thought I was in that world, right? We're on 1,500 public television and radio stations, community television, radio, but it is a different world. And now so many of these distribution platforms have been taken over so that political documentaries, the Oscar winning documentaries, have very little, if any, distribution. And so they are, T and Carl, really reinventing the wheel. They are doing it themselves, but it's amazing the hunger for independent voices all over the country, the clamor. They thought they could get on into a few theaters, hopefully more than it's just so funny that yours is called the Little Theater, because I grew up, my high school had a little theater. We'd always talk about going to the Little Theater. So I think of it as a sanctuary, and I hope to someday be there in person. But to be in theaters all over the country, and I mean, now scores of theaters are asking them and asking the independent distributors they're working with, can we show this film? And here in New York, it's sold out night after night after night. And I hope that's going to be a message, even to the corporate distributors. No, people want this. It's lucrative, even for them.
100%. Yeah,
And breaking news, just to say, I'm sorry to interrupt, but we are now in 75 theaters. We
Wow.
are, and that we haven't even begun the release yet. So we hope that after our blowout opening weekend in New York, that may double.
I think it will. I think the word of mouth on this is going to be fiercely strong. And, you know, there is that desire, you know, that we have to hear more truth and to hear it in an unflinching way, which I think this really is. I think there's an approachability to this story, that Amy is brilliant, but she's also very approachable. And so it makes us all want to be better people ourselves individually. So I think that's a pure part of this as well. Going back to the filmmaking for a second, I think about Democracy Now! Being on the air for 30 years, an hour a day, talk about the amount of archival to work with and all that you shot. Like, how much material did you have? What was the editing process like? And you know, you still haven't pulled out all your hair, so I'm so impressed.
We've gotten a little gray, but well, no, I mean, I'll start. You know, for me, my last film was about a group of women who were doing something illegal in the 60s. They didn't have cell phone cameras. They didn't want any photographs of what they did. It was about the Abortion Underground group. So that was a crazy challenge because, you know, it was a visual film. So we had to make use of very limited archival. On this film, there was, as you say, 30 years worth of archival. It was this embarrassment of riches. And Amy entrusted us with not only the outtakes and the studio recordings and the field recordings of Democracy Now!, but also her personal archive. And not only that, there were other broadcast news organizations covering Democracy Now!, covering some of the events that Democracy Now! Covered, so, though from some different angles. Um, and there were other independent filmmakers actually filming Amy, for example, during the lead up to the Iraq War. So we we're gifted with this incredible archive. We also shot a bunch of stuff ourselves in the contemporary moment, as well as the interviews. And we had a very talented editor by the name of Mona Davis who helped us make sense of it all and go through every single piece of footage to pull out the really great stuff. And there was so much great stuff, that it was really, there were some very, very, very hard choices to make.
And we didn't want to present a talking head film. We were because so what Democracy Now! Does, one of the things that distinguishes it from other news media, broadcast and radio, maybe not quite as much radio, but is that, and Juan says it in the film, on Democracy Now! We just let people talk. We let people have the time to say what they need to say. And that's why T and I are long form documentary filmmakers, is, you kind of throw off the constraints and you get to let a story breathe and have some context, and you get to be intimate with the story and with the people telling it. And so, already it was sort of tailor made. What Amy and Democracy Now! Do is all about context and story. And so for us, which is often the challenge for filmmakers, is we had it in front of us, we just couldn't screw it up. And that's a lot of pressure. And like Tia said, Mona's an incredible verite editor. And so we approached this film because we had all these outtakes and this incredible archive as a verite film to sort of tell stories that breathe. And we looked at, and so we hope that it feels, as a result of that, it feels more cinematic than it otherwise might have.
Absolutely. I'd love to talk about the opening sequence for a minute. Like, I feel like I'm sure everyone wants to talk about that, but I feel like it sets the tone. I feel like it's sadly funny. We shouldn't be laughing, but we are. I also wonder how many pairs of sneakers you all went through trying to make this movie. Like, having, I wonder about the the athleticism here that was involved too.
Well, I will
Well,
say that at the Telluride Film Festival, one of the pieces of swag we got and we coveted is we each got a pair of Hoka sneakers, and that was well needed because we definitely wore through a bunch of souls chasing Amy. And in fact, we were going to call the film Chasing Amy, but unfortunately, that title was already taken. So yeah, it was sort of a no-brainer, but it was actually Carl's idea early on when we were editing to open the film with that scene of Amy chasing P. Wells Griffith down the hallways of the climate summit in Poland. And for us, it sort of told you everything you needed to know about Amy, or it set her up. She's this determined, relentless journalist on the ground, not willing to take no comment for an answer. And she practices journalism like it's as you say, like an athletic event. So we thought it was really an important way to get people into the film. And we tried to keep that pace. That is Amy's pace 24/7. And so I don't know if you noticed that the filmmaking is a little breathless, but that's because, Amy is a little breathless. So, or at least we were in following her.
and we wish we could say that we say following her ourselves, and we weren't. And that was before we'd engaged with the film. And that's a tribute that it was covered from so many angles to Democracy Now! Because they saw this moment and they weren't going to miss it. And so they had 3 cameras following this guy who refused, the man who was designated by the president to represent his administration at the UN Climate Summit, and he refused to answer the most obvious, simple questions.
And of course, he had just been standing there. We had just come off of our show. We weren't planning to do an interview at that moment. So there was Hani Massoud, our videographer, who almost was on the Egyptian basketball team. And we had my other colleagues, Mike Burke and Dennis Moynihan. They just had their iPhones. And all of a sudden, we saw him. He was singular because he was the only one representing the Trump administration, but had enough wherewithal to set up these panels on oil, gas, and coal. This was in Katowice, Poland. This is the week that Greta Thunberg was first at 15 years old speaking out. And we had recorded this incredible speech of this child. And we're putting it out to the world for the first time. And we see this fully grown man who was talking about just espousing oil and gas. And so it's critical. And when he said, this is harassment, and I said, a reporter asking you questions, sir, is not harassment. He has the fate of the planet in his hands. It's that serious. The president of the United States is the most powerful person on earth. He has his representative there. The US is historically the largest greenhouse gas emitter. What we do matters. And so it's absolutely critical. That scene was hilarious in one sense, if I could get my breath, in that this Katowice Convention Center was built to look like a coal mine. So it had a lot of false stairs up and down. And that's what he kept running up. And then he'd have to come back down at me because it didn't go anywhere. But that really tells you everything. As they were glorifying coal, we look at a heating planet. And so many thousands of people who come to these UN climate summits from the front lines, the most devastated. You often think nothing happens at these summits. It's those gatherings that happen outside, some of those people getting arrested because they're not allowed in, they don't get a badge, who we are talking to.
It's pretty, yeah, it sets the tone for what we're about to see for the rest of it. I think also, Amy, about sort of the first act, and a lot of it is your story and how you communicated with your family is so incredible and wonderful, and also makes it feel like you didn't ever have a choice to not do Democracy Now! and be a journalist. Like, it just seems that was such part of your DNA.
It totally was. In junior high school and high school, my older brother, Steve, he was involved with a high school newspaper. My younger brother, you all just saw Dave's Press. And I was the one who dunned my family, my grandfather, my aunt, my uncle, for the penny subscription, and people had to pay. And then that little Dave's Press, we would slip it under everyone's door, where we were living in Long Island. And then he would mail it to my grandparents and all my great aunts and uncles who had fled the Holocaust. And we knew what was at stake with issues. And, Tia, too, what we have in common. Carl, I was just in Mexico City with at the Ambulante Film Festival, where some of his family lives. And Tia, her mother is a Holocaust survivor. And that has imbued so much, very much perhaps behind the scenes, but also in the foreground. The idea of we all must save each other and save this planet. We can't leave it to anyone else.
Yeah. Yes. I feel like I want a round of applause for that at that moment. So I think this film is a lesson, right? Of why, a reminder, perhaps not a lesson, but a reminder of why it's so important to have journalists out there and doing this work and being, having such integrity. What advice would you give to all of us, to support journalists at this point? What is the best thing that people can go do after watching this film?
Support independent media in all of its forms. I mean, Little Theater is run by WXXI, very important public radio. Do not take this for granted. We have to keep the public in public media. So we work on television, on radio, on the internet, and of course, in all the public, all the social media platforms. We don't believe people should, if they want something, they should come to us. We've never thought that. We must go to where people are. But here is Carl and Tia taking this film out, sort of like playing on the title, Steal This Story, Please. Steal it, folks, all over, not only this country, but around the world. Because people in the rest of the world, my little puppy is growling next to me, Zazu, leading paparazzi of our time. People around the world understand government media, state media. They understand private media run by corporations. But this idea of listener supported, viewer supported, reader supported is novel. It comes out of Pacifica Radio, which was founded right after World War II. And it is such an important model. And as legacy media breaks down, I think that's the model we have to turn to. And that really is the hope of the future.
And in the wake of the funding cuts of the Trump administration and the Congress pulling the plug on the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, those, that support is more necessary than ever. And the questions that Amy's been asking for decades are, I think, more urgent than ever. So we're happy that we're using that community stations, radio and television, are using the opening of this film throughout the country to raise money for their vital work. And it's just sort of a gift to us that we can have that opportunity to connect with them and to bring Amy on the road, where she has so many fans. She's so beloved and potentially, can expand her reach.
Yeah. And on our tour, we might very well be the thing that keeps Hoka in business.
We can't be corporate sponsored, so but we're just flying through the airports, and we're starting in New York and going to California, to Los Angeles, to the Bay Area, to Cleveland and Sarasota. I want to compliment Tia and Carl again, because at the film festivals, I hope Zazu isn't too loud, but at the film festivals around the country, they have won more than a dozen either Audience Choice Awards for Best Film or Grand Jury prizes. And it's really been amazing to see the response of audiences, because audiences are what is going to make or break this film. When someone goes into a theater, we don't usually think of it as a political act, but it is just in itself. To go to movies that you care about, it lets other places know all over the country that this really is something that we want to show as well.
Right. There's this prevailing notion, the conventional wisdom among a lot of the gatekeepers of television, of streamers, of even theatrical releases, that, audiences don't want to see political films. Well, that's just not true. And I think that we have these audience awards, to put the lie to that. I remember when Carl and I were first pitching our film Trouble the Water in 2008. It was about 2 months after Katrina made landfall in the Gulf Coast and devastated so much of that region. And we had a number of broadcasters say, well, people have Katrina fatigue. They don't want to hear about it anymore. And it was like, are you kidding? Like, we made this film and audiences turned out, we got nominated for an Oscar. But I'll tell you something, as great as it is to be Oscar nominated, I think that the audience awards that we've gotten for this film is even better, because it's not a select few, group of people that are putting their stamp on this film. It's audiences, it's people, who care about movie going, and they, and it's audiences like the one we're talking to right now at the Little Theater. We need you to show up to support films like these, not just ours, but of every other film that comes your way, and also to support the Little Theater, because we cannot take our independent art houses for granted. They will go away.
Indeed, indeed. It's a really challenging, but also an incredible time for art houses at this very moment. Since I'm in my office at the Rochester Institute of Technology and teach documentary filmmaking, and I have you both here, I would love to hear any words of wisdoms for aspiring students that are dreaming up their future careers in this industry.
Carl.
Well, I don't have an easy answer to that because what I want to say is it depends on what one wants to accomplish, but it's not going to be easy, I can say, because but that depends on the choices that we make and what kinds of stories that we want to tell. And the only reason I hesitate is because T and I have chosen a hard way to do this. And you know, stubbornly, for better or for worse, we've decided not to compromise ourselves in certain ways that might impact our career. We've enjoyed a lot of success, and success, you know, by our standards, and success by traditional, you know, metrics as well. But so with that in mind, I think that the what makes film so wonderful is when it feels authentic. And the only way it's ever going to be authentic is if you let yourself be a part of your story, if you let yourself be impacted by what you're doing. And so tell stories about things that matter to you, about things that you connect with, because you can't fool an audience. The audience is going to tell if you're just kind of going through the motions or you're following a formula. And you know, so that's one sort of meta piece. But another little thing that T and I always remind each other of is never be afraid to fail. Because if you start limiting yourself at the beginning, then you are going to fail. And so and that'll get in the way of you following what your heart tells you you need to be doing. So you need to take risks, and they will pay off. And it's okay if it fails.
I would just add, and I thought that's great, Carl. The very simple, but I think kind of deceptively simple advice that our mentor, Joan Churchill, the great cinematographer, gave us years ago when she was shooting with us in Wisconsin. We were following the Tea Party and the union public union members that were rising to stand up to the extremist takeover of their Republican Party. And anyhow, what Joan Churchill said to us was point the camera at what interests you. And it really is profound advice because, you know, Amy Goodman interests us, you know, that somebody who's so profoundly committed to the principles of journalism and storytelling, you know, and so yes, point the camera what interests you. Don't just follow the herd. Oftentimes we find ourselves, and I think we see Amy's crew at places, they're pointing the camera in the other direction. The media's looking this way, they're looking that way because they care about what interests them and they're accountable to the audience, not to their corporate owners. So, yes, point the camera at what interests you.
And can I say, just to add, my observation of watching Joan put that into practice all the time is frequently, um, and yet we'd end up with, she would be so interested that she would move in so close, and it was beautiful. But you know, she took that to heart.
No, if you listen to Amy Goodman on her show every morning, you could hear sometimes they cover it up, but some you could hear her response to people's questions and to the footage, and you hear like audibly, you know, some groans, some you can see her giddy sometimes when there's something exciting happening, but you can see her, you can almost hear her tears because I don't watch her, I listen to her, um, and so it's profound. I know that every time she's talking to somebody, it's because she cares. But we've said enough. I think, Amy, I'd love to hear your answer to that question.
I would just end by saying our job as reporters, as journalists, as filmmakers is to go to where the silence is And it's often not that quiet, actually. It's raucous, people are organizing, it's rowdy, it's loud, but it's not hitting the corporate media radar screen. And that's what we're picking up. I don't think it's about a fringe minority, because those who care about war and peace, those who care about the climate catastrophe, the fate of the planet, about LGBTQ issues and racial and economic equality, are not a fringe minority, not even a silent majority, but the silenced majority, silenced by the corporate media, which is why we have to take it back.
Wow, this was incredible. I feel so honored to get to spend time with all of you and have this discussion. I'm really grateful you took the time to do this. We are screening this on April 29th, but then we have a limited run at the Little, and people can find their times and listings at thelittle.org. And the Little was part of the Little Film Society, which is probably was related to the art house that you were talking about, Amy. It actually opened up.
Oh.
It opened up in October of 1929, the day before the stock market collapsed. So it's been around for a while, this theater.
Well, thank you so much, Linda. It was wonderful to meet you too.
Thank you, Linda, and thank you to your audience and to your students for pursuing this work.
Thank you. Have a great afternoon.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.